we use ranked choice, more people get a voice. It's not a case of I lose if you win. When we find common ground, we can turn this thing around and somehow solve this mess that we are in. There are always more than 2 points of view.
Well, welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Ronna, and this weekend is going to be the second anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a UN international treaty. And as we have done in New London for the last couple years, since it came into force in 2021, we have had a local celebration of that fact. So to talk about what we're going to do in New London and about the treaty in general today, I welcome Ann Scheibner. Welcome, Ann. And I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about the history of the treaty just to start with.
Yes, I think that would be very appropriate. So in 2017, 122 of the 193 United Nations member countries voted in favor of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And what that meant they were signing on to was that they would not only not manufacture, produce all of those things, nuclear weapons, but they also wouldn't allow them in the country. They wouldn't allow them to be stored, passed through any form of support, and they absolutely were against the use of such weapons. And so the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was, I think, the organizing force, the sort of the networking force behind all of this activity. And in 2017, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which seems absolutely appropriate. And it was a long-term process, I think, both for them to get to the point of introducing it to the United Nations, and then the what was basically a 3-year process for countries to ratify it. To have it signed on to at the United Nations was not the same thing as having your state government ratify it. And so the tipping point was 50 countries, that when and if 50 countries actually ratified the treaty, that then there would be a 90-day waiting period, at which point the treaty would go into force. And so Honduras was the tipping point country. And when we look later at the map, we'll see what an amazing record Central and South America have with countries signing on to this. But Honduras was the 50th to ratify it in October of 2020. And so 90 days later, it was January 22nd, 2021, and the treaty went into force. And there's been a lot of progress since then, which we can look at when we talk about when we see the maps.
Yeah, and I'll share my screen. And actually, we can look right at the map.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah, and so this map does not have the countries labeled. However, we did do a little bit of checking of some of the larger areas that we weren't sure we could identify before we started taping. So since over the last couple years, there have been gains. So do you want to talk a little bit about what the current status is?
Right. Well, the last time when we celebrated the first anniversary, 59 countries had signed on. And this year, it's 68. 65 have actually ratified it, and 3 are in the process of doing that. And in addition, there are a number of other countries, 27 additional countries are signatories to it. and so therefore are somewhere in the process of getting it introduced for consideration by their governments. So it's been a very progressive process, and if we look at the well, and you can also see that this really is a southern hemisphere movement. And a lot of the dots that you see over in the Pacific Island region are island nations, which, are undergoing the threat of climate change, but also some of them have seen firsthand nuclear testing. And so it's no accident that so many of them have come on board. It's also depressing that so few European and North American countries have come on board, notably the United States and Canada, Russia, China, Israel, India, I think France, Germany. Countries that have access to nuclear weapons have not signed on to this yet. And so part of the genius, I think, of the ICAN group's idea was to not wait either for nuclear annihilation or for the third World War, but to say there had to be a way for small countries, for countries that were not necessarily possessors of nuclear weapons, to indicate their total abhorrence of the idea of nuclear weapons and what they represent, and to begin the movement to try to get such weapons abolished. And I think today, being Martin Luther King's birthday celebration, that is something that he would really applaud, the idea of this being a movement-based initiative of countries that, for the most part, whose militaries would not necessarily have these weapons. Although, again, it's just great to see if you look at the green on the map. I mean, it's the European countries that have signed on to it include Ireland, which, as Joanne Sheehan for the War Resisters League would be able to tell you in detail, has experienced oppression of its own. And I think what we've seen happening with Ukraine in the last year indicates that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is not something that we've gone past that. If anything, the last year has indicated just how dangerous it is for any country to have such weapons. And if you look at the big green in the center here, that is Kazakhstan. So both Ronna and I were amazed to see that they have ratified this treaty along with South Africa and Venezuela and Mexico, New Zealand.
Brazil. Oh, well, Brazil's yellow.
Brazil's a signatory. The yellow countries are the signatories. The green ones have actually ratified. So that it's really wonderful to see how this has grown even in the last year.
Yeah, Central America from one end to the other is,
Yes, and all the islands.
Well, I guess that really, it's an interesting point that we don't wait for the powers, because the powers that have these weapons, I don't know if the governments feel confident that because they have the weapons, they won't, and we won't, our citizens won't be victimized by them. But that is pretty faulty reasoning.
Yes. Yes.
It doesn't really, having those weapons doesn't really protect us from being victimized by those weapons.
Yes. And I think Albert Einstein, who I think spent the latter part of his life feeling in large part responsible for the development of the atom bomb, given the use of his famous formula, E equals mc squared, as the basis for the technological development of such a weapon, very famously said, the advent of the bomb meant everything has changed except the way we think. And that, I think, is why it's so important what ICANN did and what these nations who have signed on and ratified the treaty have done, is to change their way of thinking and say, no, these weapons do not protect us and in fact are extremely dangerous. And we're on a hair trigger for the end of human life on this planet, thanks to the prevalence of all these weapons and the race of many countries to get them. Because it's North Korea clearly thought the only thing the United States would respect was someone who had nuclear weapons. So it's been a very dangerous practice and very outdated. And it's, I don't know how except to look for little snippets of leverage and therefore of hope, which each of these countries represents, to get the kind of change that's needed. So let's, hope that we can continue this into the new year.
And as we pointed out last year, the film Don't Look Up was shown about the same time of year. I think that was a coincidence, but it really brought home the reality that climate change is really a threat that is much more tangible to us. Someone, and a pretty conservative person I know, had mentioned at one time, well, we put all this money into the submarines and weaponry in this country, but it's been hurricanes that have caused damage on the U.S. shores, not other countries' aggression. So we're sort of looking the wrong way if we're thinking about protecting our people from threats. I am going to show, these are the latest countries to ratify. So Guatemala probably might have been the last one in Central America, and now it's a solid green line. And so the number does keep going up. Let me stop sharing. So what you mentioned was changing the mindset. And in New London, that seems particularly challenging because this is an issue that's very pertinent to development issues we've been seeing in New London over the past, decades, really, with, off and on, sometimes more and sometimes less, that much of our economic development has revolved around having a robust submarine industry to create, good union jobs. So how do we go about not changing the mindset and the reality in our region to maybe go a little different direction?
Well, I think it's a very difficult thing. I have submitted an op-ed piece. I live and work at St. Francis House, and with the support of my community, I've submitted an op-ed piece to the Day, reflecting on what happened when a lot of people, 28,000 in the stadium and millions in the TV audience, saw what happened to Damara Hamlin on that Monday, barely 2 weeks ago. And that included me. I'm a cradle New York Giants fan. And so what really struck me was what he asked after he was resuscitated and came to 2 days later in the hospital, he said, "Did we win?" And that just made me think again about both how competitive I am and how competitive, our culture is, and what that competition and the violence of it and the damage that it does to human beings, right? That we see on the playing field all the time, and we see them hit and we see them get up, and it never occurs to us that something serious is happening because we don't get to see that. We don't even get to see the broken bones, the ribs, the strained muscles. My classmate in college was Janet McDonald Hill, whose husband Calvin Hill played for the Dallas Cowboys. And I think it was our 5th reunion, I said, "How's your husband?" And she said, "Well, he can't sleep without his leg up because his knee hurts." And that was sort of the first time I'd ever really thought about it. And the same thing when the news of the effects of dementia started becoming clear about what the head injuries were long term. And again, we as fans never see it. So that question, did we win, made me think about, we won't have time to talk about it. I mean, nuclear weapons strikes would be 30 minutes launch time, right, to impact. And Groton, New London, we definitely are a target, a ground zero in big terms. And so that just made me think that, well, maybe this what terrible thing happened to Damar Hamlin gives us a chance to think about the violence that we're allowing to be on hair trigger alert, right, for the entire world. And it's so difficult to think about. I mean, it really is difficult to think about. Another Einstein quote is that, he used to vacation in Stonington, Watch Hill. My father remembers seeing him sailing in his boat. And I think he did watercolors, or he was an artist. And so this other quote is, "I am enough of an artist to draw freely on my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." And I think that's part of, what's embodied in the Bible in Proverbs 29. Without vision, the people perish. And we're in terrible danger because of that. And our policy thinking, I mean, given the way that our leaders have responded to the Ukrainian crisis, is to treat this as if it were World War II still, and that NATO was still a reasonable response, which if we had declared victory and disbanded NATO and invited Russia to join the European Union, we would have a new economic basis for all of this. And what Archbishop Lester called in his pastoral letter, he's the Archbishop of Santa Fe, and he did a peace pastoral last year because he, in Santa Fe, feels, because of the presence of Los Alamos and the nuclear weapons research that still goes on there and is responsible for a lot of the economic prosperity in New Mexico, that the church needed to take some responsibility in trying to generate exactly this kind of conversation about how do we change the economic basis so that we aren't dependent on weapons of mass destruction, on their, on the research, development, and production, and having them present in our community every time one of those subs goes up the river. We need to think about that. And I know we've had people at our St. Francis House Clarification of Thought who have expressed surprise that there are actual nuclear weapons on any of those submarines. How can that be? But in fact, that is what the system is based on. It's a not very reassuring basis given human frailty and, as we know recently, the possibility that computers have glitches. And again, you don't have a chance to correct them, and thousands of people minimally get stranded in airports as a result. But that's what happens when the technology can't keep up with what's actually happening. And all these weapons that we've got are decaying. So you would think a place like, Electric Boat could be retooled to help take some of these things apart. We already have a lot of toxic waste sites on the base. So again, there ought to be a lot of interest in the area, and are developing the highly skilled, highly paid, highly needed jobs to dismantle these things rather than build a new generation of delivery systems. But that is a hard sell at the moment. I mean, again, it's a matter of where do we have the opportunities to even begin to think about changing our way of thinking.
And, I've read a lot of Jane Jacobs stuff, and one of her kind of axioms about economic growth in cities is you figure out what you're importing, because those are things you need so much that you'll pay for it to, come from outside, and start manufacturing it internally. And then eventually, maybe you can start enough of an industry that you're exporting it. So I think about all the things that are maybe not exactly comparably complex to submarines, but maybe need many of the same skills. Public transit, we import train cars, we import trolley cars, we import some, wind, alternative energy
Yes.
generators.
Yeah.
Some of these things are being manufactured all over the globe, and we're bringing them in. And it seems as though it wouldn't, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it would take a lot of the same skills and know-how to apply it to that sort of technological solution that we use for the submarine. So, one thing we always think about when we want to shift industries is, a just transition for the people who are working in those industries. But it seems as though we could create a lot of jobs that are require comparable skills. And, the government funds the military industries cost plus. It isn't even as though they have to be competitive and make a profit. We could use a lot of the same models to create things that we desperately need.
Well, and I think your point is well taken. The money is there. It's a matter of who's getting it. And you could fund worker retraining, not just for the actual educational programs, but for real stipends. How much do they make currently? And it's not a lot, actually, as I understand, what entry-level workers in the yard at EB are getting. So if you set up something so that people were guaranteed the incomes that they have, right? And they could pay their mortgage, food, clothing, healthcare. It'd be great if we could have healthcare on a more affordable basis. But in any case, that, there would be that package per person. And then I would be willing to bet, and maybe we need a local task force working on, how much it would be if every person who wanted and needed a job, quote unquote, but wanted to be working on something that would build community instead of something dangerous to life here and everywhere, that we could do it. And we could come up with something that I bet would cost a lot less than what these present cost overrun contracts are doing, especially in the corporate structure, where it's the executives who get paid the most and not the people who are actually doing the work.
Now, maybe we should talk about what we're going to be doing in New London to celebrate this. And I do have a couple pictures. We can talk while I share the screen of what we did, I think it was 2 years ago. Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
how can people participate this year?
So the actual anniversary is on Sunday. We're hoping a lot of faith communities will share that information, and anyone who's watching this could ask that information be shared on Sunday, which is the anniversary, that we will be doing the witness on Monday from 2:30 to 4 o'clock at the corners of Howard and Bank Street in downtown New London. And it would be great to have people come. We, as you can see from the pictures, we still have the posters thanking each of the countries that had ratified the treaty formerly, and hopefully we'll have some new posters made for this one to thank the new countries that have signed on. So let's see, and I think you've got the banner that.
Yeah, there is a large banner. Let me see if I can find this and show the big banner that we will. No, it's not that. Let me find oh, this is. I'll share the screen so we can see our big banner, which is not just our local banner, but it's. This is the official banner. The treaty bans the development, testing, production, manufacture, acquisition, possession, or stockpiling, transfer, control, receipt, use, or threat to use, stationing, or deployment of nuclear weapons. So we do have a large banner for this as well. And we will be meeting, as Ann said, on Monday at 2:30 at Bank and Howard Street. It's going to all be outdoors, so we can still social distance, which is sadly still needed. But we can spread out. But we want to be visible both to people who work at EB who are not the targets of our dissatisfaction. And also to other passersby along Bank Street in New London in a very busy intersection.
Yeah. And we certainly we need everybody, and that includes people who have the skills and know what's available as skills and resources at EB to be part of this rethinking what it is that could happen if we put our minds to it.
And now in like the last 4 or 5 minutes we have, we happen to be taping this on Monday, the 16th, to be aired tomorrow, the 17th. And today is the day of the Martin Luther King holiday for this year. So I thought it particularly appropriate to think a little bit about some of the message of Dr. King, some of the messages that have not totally been as popularized as just having a dream. So I don't know if you have a quote relevant to that.
Well, I do. I mean, it's I think you've got the banner that we use.
I do. Let me. I can share the screen and show the Martin Luther King banners we have that we've used in some past demonstrations in New London. This is the first one.
And I think this one, both of these come from Dr. King's Declaration of Independence from the war in Vietnam, the address that he gave at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, the year to the day before he was assassinated. And I think Dr. King would be appalled at the fact that we are putting billions and planning to put more billions over the next 10 years into a new generation of nuclear weapons. And that includes in space, which should, which John Kennedy and previous administrations devoted a lot of time and effort to saying no to that. So we need to get a little more accountability from our elected officials on not spreading this danger. But this quote from Dr. King, declare eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism, was what he saw as at the root of the destroying the soul of this country that was happening, that he saw in the Vietnam War, but also clearly has continued. We had Ed Rodman come and speak at All Souls, from one of the founding members of St. Francis House Board, canon missioner for the Diocese of Massachusetts. And he was a member of SNCC back in the day. And so on the 40th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, Canon Rodman gave a wonderful talk in which he reminded us that at the end of his life, that Dr. King saw the problem with becoming an icon of the movement instead of the developer of the people, grassroots people in the movement, which I think has begun to happen today. That's why he was supporting the Poor People's Campaign then. The Poor People's Campaign continues anew now, and we have a chance to deconstruct a lot of the lies which went into developing these weapons in the first place. Ed used as an example how it is that we came to have smoke-free environments. Some of us are old enough to remember being in meetings with many people smoking away, and restaurants where the air was clouded, literally. And what Ed asked us to think about was, how did that change happen? And the first thing that had to happen was people asking the question, whether it was true that smoking didn't harm you. And even though the cigarette industry spent millions to try to provide fake news, fake information, fake research, that it was not harmful, unfortunately, the evidence became incontrovertible that it was. And so at that point, everyone on a local level just did what they could, right? And finally, you had a new vision and a new reality because people understood and everybody accepted what needed to be done. And so I think, again, the basis of opposing the forces that are using up all our time and talent and treasure in this country, we have a chance to redo that again if we realize that we have to support each other in doing this work that needs to be done, and electing people who will also share that vision.
Well, yeah, and I think maybe for a change, we have to stop looking at ourselves as the leader and figure that some of these small countries, the green dots we saw all over the globe, are really maybe the leaders in this issue and not the superpowers. Well, thank you, Anne. I hope we see you,
Thank you.
On Monday. We're going to show after this a video that was made 2 years ago anticipating the entry into force of the treaty about the New London and Groton area of confronting the danger of nuclear weapons, because we do have a very long and storied history right here in our town. So thank you, Anne. And next week, Eddie Long will be on the show, and we'll talk about the value of art in our community. So we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are here today on City Pier in New London, January 22nd, 2021. Today, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons goes into force, as they say, goes into effect. And we're here today because we want to begin this process in this day by remembering the first people who came to oppose the building of the submarines here in New London, Connecticut. So the Committee for Nonviolent Action started in the late 1950s as an organization to really focus on the buildup of nuclear weapons. And they came to southeastern Connecticut, according to their own information, to quote-unquote educate Americans to the realities and dangers of the nuclear deterrent policy typified by the Polaris submarines and their deadly cargoes of nuclear missiles. And those submarines were made across the river, as all of the strategic nuclear weapons have been made, the submarines. They call their campaign Polaris Action. And on June 1st, they moved into 13 North Bank Street, which I believe is where the garage is right now. There is no more North Bank Street over there. But that's where they wanted to establish themselves, right here in this area, in this community. There was an article in The Day about them appearing. So The Day partially says, the Committee for Nonviolent Action, CNVA, began the first phase of a 3-month protest against Polaris missile-firing submarines today with establishment of a headquarters at 13 North Bank Street. As an alternative to massive retaliation, the peace groups propose the U.S. disarm unilaterally, if necessary, and thus win some. I'm going to stop. I feel like I'm competing with the. I'll go back to reading this. I'm competing with the train station woman.
Yep, a little bit. Well, and that'll give you a chance to do what I should have done before anyway. So.
Okay, I'll go back to the beginning of the quote. Okay, I think she's done. You done?
Are you done?
I'm going to start with the
Yep.
As an alternative to massive retaliation, the peace group proposes the U.S. disarm unilaterally if necessary, and thus win support of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. Such a gesture, the CNVA maintains, would raise immense psychological barriers against war and would weaken the rationale for aggression. A walk from New York City began on June 10th and arrived here on June 17th in New London, along with the sloop Satyagraha, which came right up here. Satyagraha had what we now know as the peace symbol. CNVA claimed what then was called the nuclear disarmament symbol, which was created by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in England only a couple of years earlier and brought to this country by Bayard Rustin, who was both the founder of the Committee for Nonviolent Action and also most known as the strategist who organized the 1963 March on Washington. So at many, many times there were launches of small boats in this area over decades of people trying to get to electric boat. To prepare for those kinds of summer actions, they organized a 16-day training that took place right there in their office. Those who organized it and the resource people that came were people who had been exploring the power of nonviolent action basically since the late 1930s. They were the first people who really began to talk about right about what Gandhi was doing in India. And that included Richard Gregg, who wrote The Power of Nonviolence in 1939, Wally Nelson, who was the first nonviolence trainer for Congress of Racial Equality, his wife Juanita Nelson, who was arrested for sitting in at a lunch counter in D.C. when she was a Howard University student, Dave Dellinger, who was then at Liberation Magazine, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a black minister from Alabama who had been active very early on in the civil rights movement. Barbara Deming came and got off the train right here. She came up to write an article for The Nation magazine about Polaris Action and about the training. She came planning to spend a day. What she said in her article that she wrote was, I've been reading Gandhi eagerly for the past year, but I expected to be unimpressed by the people I would find in New London. I assumed blandly that if they were in fact impressive, I would have heard about them before this. But she stayed for the whole 16 days and it changed her life. She became one of the most important writers on nonviolence, and particularly on nonviolence and feminism, and as a result being part of this community. At the end of the summer, CNBA made two decisions. One was they used to go over to the hygienic restaurant, and in there they made the decision that they would listen. They had been listening for 3 months to the workers at Electric Boat saying, go tell it to the Russians. You want to disarm, go tell it to the Russians. And they decided to go tell it to the Russians. It was at that day at the hygienic in August that they decided they would walk from San Francisco to Moscow with that message of disarmament. The other decision that they made was that they would stay here in southeastern Connecticut and continue their opposition to the Polaris submarine, continue Polaris Action. And within a few years, they bought the farm in Voluntown, thanks to Barbara Deming and her partner, Mary Miggs, which is still there.
Good afternoon. So I'm Ann Scheibner. I grew up in southeastern Connecticut in Stonington and commuted to New London for 6 years to go to high school. And after I graduated from college, I came back to help start a drop-in learning center. And in 1971, found myself going to a training at the Voluntown Peace Trust for what turned out to be the last Polaris action, because they were about to finish manufacturing that series of submarines and begin on the Trident. So Marge Swan at that time was in residence at the Voluntown Peace Trust. For those of you who get a chance to go up there, it was a drop ceiling in those days. You couldn't see the American cedar beams, you couldn't see the colonial fireplace, but thanks to Chuck Mathai, you now can. But the training is what I remember, and particularly because my high school classmates' fathers worked at EB in management, basically. I talked to Cal Robertson this morning. It turns out that both his parents worked at Electric Boat. It really was the employer for this part of the world. And what I particularly appreciated about Marge Swan and her training was the respect that she felt that we owed to the people who worked at EB by dressing appropriately. And so I wore my best blue suit and jacket and my grandmother's pearls, which I wore again today in honor of the occasion. And so it's 50 years ago. Hard to imagine that. But in the CNBA publications, they wrote about it. About 30 persons participated on the days of protest. Many thousands of leaflets were handed to workers and guests. Workers posted them on bulletin boards inside the plant. Many of the workers had seen us before. Many were new, many were veterans of war, including now the Vietnam War. They were attentive. They were seldom hostile. They were troubled, it seemed, by the job that they were trapped in. What can we do, was the question. What do you say to a worker whose family is fed and clothed and housed by military spending? Convert the plant to peacetime use, to fabricate houses, schools, hospitals, to build ships to transport food to starving people, we said. But what do I do in the meantime? General Dynamics should pay you with the profits that they have made from war while they tool up for peace. Pay you not to make things of destruction. Pay you not to make submarines. Like the government pays the farmers. This is 50 years ago, really, yeah? $4 billion not to grow food. But these subs, said the workers, are providing us with protection, they said. Only until the first bomb drops, we answered. And so it went. The discomfort of the guests was obvious. They very often chose not to accept our leaflet that outlined the extent of General Dynamics' involvement in the arms race. Don't remind us, they said in their glances. We came to a party with a band and banners and flowery speeches. A celebration over the carcass of death to come, unless nations of people can lay aside these grotesque instruments and persistently settle their differences rationally and with compassion for the children of other lands, with as much compassion as we display for our own. Were it only so that we start with Vietnam, the protest grows. Perhaps President Nixon, or other president, and his government will respond. Our frustration and sense of doubt is increased by the recently released articles about the secret and deviousness with which the government prepared for and fought a war under the guise of helping a determined people to establish democracy. What a lie. What a tragedy. What disservice to those in the service of their country. What disservice to the worker, the builder of the weapons, and more. What of the receivers of these instruments? What deception is being practiced today that we may discover years hence, or maybe never find out? It's all connected. Electric boat submarines, the war in Vietnam, the hunger for food and justice and peace. CNVA hopes that one day right will prevail. And here we are in this sanitized industrial workspace. I was trying to think of a mural that would do justice to the melting flesh of people in Hiroshima. Because the images that I grew up with were of vacant shells of buildings. The idea that people suffered in the dropping of those weapons was totally not in the history books. We have to find a way to help our young people understand what's at stake, and hopefully their children will not have to be here 50 years from now. Thank you.
The submarine, as we know, submarine production continued. The Polaris became the first submarine with nuclear weapons on it. And then the replacement for that became the Trident submarine. The keel laying of the first Trident submarine was in April of 1976. And Liz McAllister, who was right here holding the sign, was one of the 8 people who went to the keel laying of that and attempted to pour blood and was arrested for that. So So Liz really gets credit for being both the first group of people to protest Trident, and then as part of the Kings Bay Plowshares, the last group to protest Trident decades and decades later. So over those years, there were several organizations. After the keel laying, Rick and myself moved up here with a community of folks who moved into the Community for Nonviolent Action in Voluntown, and we organized the Trident Conversion Campaign, which then later became the Stop Trident Commission, and demonstrated at launches and commissionings. And Rick's going to talk about that.
My name is Rick Gomer, and I've lived in southeastern Connecticut since 1976. Just after that keel of that first Trident was laid. It is kind of amazing that somehow, as the Polaris submarines were aging, that during the Nixon and Ford presidencies, they decided that they would create a weapon that was thousands of times worse than the Polaris submarine. And yet that's what they did. They designed a system that, if ever used, just one out of the 24 submarines would have ended all life on Earth. And they built 24 of them, so I don't know what other planets they were thinking they would destroy, but this one was doomed if any of those were ever used. So we determined that this weapon system should never be built. It was an atrocity, and we would demonstrate, and we would organize demonstrations. So when the Ohio had was launched in 1979, we had 4,000 protesters join us in front of Electric Boat. Now, partly that was because this was also when the anti-nuclear power movement was growing. The Seabrook demonstrations had happened, and we did our best to kind of meld those two so that people would understand the dangers of all types of radiation, not just if a nuclear weapon was used, but also from nuclear power plants. And we continued that work. And at every launch and significant event in the Trident being built, we always had anywhere from 3,000 to 1,000 people joining us in front of the boat for launches and for the commissionings, when the boat would actually be out at sea and be used. And some of these demonstrations got really interesting. There was a submarine that was supposed to be the USS Rhode Island, but they renamed it after the senator who really made it possible for the Tridents to happen, and that was Senator Henry Jackson. And so we had a vigil at the commissioning, and also a protest at the launch. And for some reason, the Young Republicans for Peace Through Strength and the Ku Klux Klan showed up at both of those events. Only 6 to 8 Klansmen, but quite a few of the Young Republicans. But for us, it made it obvious that the waste of resources that were going into these machines were starving the communities of color in the United States and the poor, and so having the Young Republicans and the Klan there supporting the building of these things made it pretty plain what side one should be on. They originally said they were going to build 24 Trident submarines. The Soviet Union collapsed late 80s, early 90s. So did the support for building Tridents. So they stopped at 18. 18 Tridents. Well, they were plenty. I mean, they were 17 more than needed to destroy the Earth, but they finished them. And then as the 90s rolled along, and as they started working on disarming, on lowering the nuclear threshold, I mean, even to this day, we have got nuclear weapons out there that are just a trigger away from being launched, and it's really incredible. But the Tridents have been cut back now. They made the 18, and then with treaties with the Russians, they had to retire 4 of them. They turned them into fast attack submarines, and with the remaining 14, they had to fill 4 of their 24 missile silos with cement, so that they could only have 20 missiles. Oh well. But now the Tridents have been active since 1979, and one by one they'll be being retired after 44 years of service. By 2042, all the Tridents will have been retired, unless we retire them sooner, which I think could be a great idea. So they've designed this program to build 12 new nuclear weapon submarines, ballistic missile submarines, called the Columbia class. And they're hoping to get that rolling in the next year or 2. And they're building a brand new building at the south end of Electric Boat because they need a bigger dry dock to build this new class of submarine. It's as deadly as the Tridents were, actually maybe even more deadly, depending on how much work they do on creating the smaller nuclear warheads that they like to have. At this point, I forget how much we're spending per year, but it's trillions of dollars to make our nuclear arsenal even more dangerous than it is now. All of this is such a waste, and hopefully it will be stopped.
Hey folks, we're here today at the bottom of the Thames River, just in front of the Electric Boat Shipyard, where the Trident submarines and fast attack submarines have been built, and where the Navy is gearing up to build the next level of nuclear submarines, the Columbia. And we are here to celebrate the nuclear treaty that is going to be effective as of today. It will make nuclear weapons illegal, and we hope that the 50 signatories and all the other folks signing on to the nuclear ban will join us in celebrating this historic day. Up the river is the U.S. Navy submarine base. Behind us is Electric Boat Shipyard, and the Naval Underwater Systems Center was here on the left. That's where the engineering department of Electric Boat is right now. This particular area has been gifted with a number of plowshares actions over the years. I think there have been 3 or 4 in this area. My participation in the Thames River plowshares in 1989 was just down the river here. We jumped in the river and swam up to the submarine, and some other folks took a canoe and paddled down, and we were able to hammer and mark the submarine as the death machine it is. And we witnessed in court, and we are part of the Solidarity Plowshares movement with folks from Kings Bay that are serving prison sentences right now for their part in disarmament actions. I'd like to just read the banner that we're holding. I know for myself, one of the great horrors of the arms race is the theft from people that need food and resources and medicine and education and shelter. The United States plans to spend $100,000 per minute over the next 10 years on nuclear weapons. And that's why we're here today, to stand with the treaty and to stand against the arms race. Thank you.
All right, I just want to wrap up a little bit more by saying that as the construction of the Trident went down, the workforce was built up with the the Seawolf contracts, the Seawolf class of submarines. But yet what happened at that point after they built one was that the Berlin Wall came down, was that the Soviet Union collapsed. And so George Bush Sr. needed to make a major cut in weapons production and made a major cut by cutting the entire Seawolf class here. We're a democratic state, easy for him to do. However, what that meant was that there were massive layoffs, and Electric Boat began the layoffs the second the announcement was made. This is an opportunity for those of us who had been organizing for economic, I have my mask on, for organizing for economic conversion in this community for decades, since Bob Swan began to do that in the early 1960s, to really organize. And so we brought together in the early 1990s, we brought together folks from Electric Boat, workers, people in the community. We did listening project surveys where we went out and asked people, what their thoughts were about what could be done. And here, right here on this pier, on May 13th, 1996, a group of us, representing the unions, representing business, representing politicians, revealed an action plan for jobs. So here on the pier was Congressman Sam Gadenson, Representative Wade Heislop, EB union leaders Ken Dela Cruz, Mel Olson, and me representing the Community Coalition for Economic Conversion. And we all agreed that public resources needed to be targeted to projects that would create good jobs, green jobs, and we suggested steps for moving forward on that. Some progress was made. We did affect some of the retraining that was done for the workers. But, as soon as there's any talk of any more money coming to the Pentagon, those kinds of plans go away. Another example of that was in 2014, the state decided, again, because the workforce was going down at Electric Boat, that they wanted to have a report on Connecticut's future, strategies to bolster Connecticut's economy. It was instructed by legislation to focus on manufacturing, defense diversification, and green technologies in the workforce development. While the committee explored all these things, a local group here thought this was a great opportunity to again talk about what it would mean for this community to have real economic conversion, and got very involved in doing this and invited the committee to come to New London. At the last minute, that was yanked. They brought it over. They brought the program over to the other side of the river. They had one of the top managers at Electric Boat talk about this new submarine that would replace Trident. They had someone from the Workforce Development Board talk about the importance of getting into the middle schools and teaching STEM to the kids so they'd be workers at Electric Boat. And now we have the Columbia class, which they have just been building up. So every time there's any effort to really look at what else could be done here, it's taken up by corporate profits. It's taken up by the idea of this money. So the aims that were first stated by CNVA, an alternative to massive retaliation, Peace Group proposes that the U.S. disarm unilaterally, if necessary, and thus win support of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. So I think today we celebrate the hundreds of millions of people throughout the world in the 51 countries and in the other countries who are moving for this treaty, who have really done what folks intended to do at the beginning. But I think we need to give credit to the grassroots groups who have been doing this work since the late 1950s to continue to raise this issue and this opposition to these horrendous nuclear weapons.